Shocking. Rick will start.
Hmm.
First off, just a real quick logistical question about the Maggie Walker Land Trust. How can you contribute land to the Maggie Walker Land Trust? Is that like, is there a representative? Is it relatively easy to do? Is it simply just gifting the land? How does that work?
Yeah, it's very easy to do. We set up the land trust so we could receive private donations. We had this lovely woman in Churchill, older woman, and she said, God owns the land, and so when I leave, I want to give it to you all. And she talked to her children and is working on that. But we haven't received a lot of private donations. I will say that we have been gifted a bank. I'm not sure gift is the right word, but we are the proud owners of a bank. Now you can imagine with the bank, there are lots of lawyers that got involved, and it took 2 painful years to accommodate that. But I think for private donations, we would want to do some due diligence. When I was on the board of Habitat, we took parcels that we should never have taken. So I think we've learned our lesson. But we would welcome the opportunity to just have a discussion and do due diligence on any parcel that people are interested in. That's what's going on with, quite frankly, in terms of the land bank with local governments. For example, Chesterfield had an old elementary school down in Ettrick, and it was never going to be an elementary school anymore. And so in December, they deeded that over to the Maggie Walker Community Land Trust, which acts as their land bank. We're the only hybrid in the country that we know of that combines those two functions. And Chesterfield, this is how efficient they can be. They deeded it to us in December. They raised the building in January. And now we're going to be able to put probably about 12 affordable homes in that community. So that's very exciting.
So Laura, at the beginning, you had mentioned that you don't see this as an issue that the city can solve. It's something that other organizations need to. Can you speak to that more about why you believe that and how you see that interacting with what we're doing?
Well, I think that I don't mean to say that the city doesn't have a role to play. I actually believe that ultimately government has to play the primary role, because I think government is the only lever that can raise the kind of funds that need to be raised. What I meant to say, and I've been talking about this for so many years, when I first started talking about this, people in this region wanted to believe, and I've been at this for a very long time, but I don't care whether you went to a church, whether you went to a Rotary, whoever I went to speak to, a business group, people wanted to believe that poverty was stopped at the city line, and that therefore poverty and housing affordability were city problems. And it's taken a long time for us to get the data out that says, guess what? The rate of poverty is increasing far more greatly in Chesterfield and Henrico than in the city of Richmond. People need to look at the demographics and update their brains. And so that's why I always want to say, look, affordable housing is a challenge throughout our region, whether you're living in Goochland. And in Goochland, the issue is often substandard housing. In New Kent, the issue may not be a sufficient supply of housing. In Powhatan, the issue is NIMBYism that really precludes even multifamily, even the consideration of multifamily. So the issues are different, but they exist throughout the region. That was really the point I was trying to make. Ultimately, we need the private sector developers to be incentivized to participate in the solution to this challenge. And that means building both market rate and then below market rate or affordable units. I believe that when you do a mixed use project, you can most effectively do a mixed income project, because think about what you've seen in mixed use. You all know this. When we do mixed use and you put an apartment over a coffee shop, they could be right down the street from a townhome, they could be right up against a single family residence. There's far less fear in the mix of those uses, in the mix of the incomes. And so mixed use, mixed income, getting the private sector engaged on that and incentivizing that. And I will say there are definitely folks who believe that we shouldn't just stop at incentives. We should make inclusionary zoning mandatory. That's a discussion that the General Assembly is probably going to have in the next 2 or 3 years. But also local governments have the tools, for example, bonding capacity to raise the dollars that need to be raised. I mean, it's either going to be through their taxing authority or through their bonding capacity that they're going to raise the dollars that have to be raised. And we're always in conversation with local governments about what that ought to look like. Had we not had a pandemic, Chesterfield was going to put a bond referendum on the ballot for November. And while they were going to call it community development, part of those bonds were going to go to affordable housing. They've done it in Raleigh. They've done it in Nashville. They've done it in Charlotte. And I think that is the path forward. That and perhaps community benefit agreements and definitely TIFs. I know TIFs got probably not the best of reputations in the city of Richmond over the last 6 months. But despite what happened with Navy Hill, TIF is a tax increment finance district is a tool that I think we ought to be utilizing. And quite frankly, if we had put TIFs down the Broad Street corridor along the Pulse years ago, as we put the Pulse in, we would have a boon of revenue where we could have funded some of our infrastructure needs and some of our housing needs. We ought to be looking at where we're going to see growth in the city, maybe in the region, and leveraging that growth and having that growth contribute to the overall well-being of the community and its citizens. So I'm pretty high on TIFs as well as bonds.
So, Laura, another question for you. I appreciate your answer. One of the things I get to hear a little bit about from folks I know working in more of the architectural development world is zoning by right. So, I've gotten the strong impression that the city zoning office is incredibly conservative about what they're willing to permit without a special waiver. I'm curious how you see that. With duplexes by right or triplexes by right, what do you think about that, and that wasn't on the chart, but how do you see that as potentially helping affordable housing and some of the housing issues we're experiencing?
Right, that's a great question. I think when I put on my, it's interesting because we have a private we Richmond Association Realtors, we advocate for private property rights, and so take the short-term rental ordinance that finally got passed by the city council last night. That was a very interesting balance that we had to strike between the rights of people to utilize their properties versus the rights or the rights of people who want to, live in their properties and not live next to the weekend frat house, right? So we had to try to strike that balance. I think the question of zoning and special use permits, I think, needs to strike that balance as well. I think that the city needlessly overwhelms itself by having so many requests that have to go through the special use permit process. Elizabeth Greenfield, who's our VP of Governmental Affairs, actually serves on the Planning Commission. And it is, I think, ridiculous what has to go through planning and then through the Planning Commission. I'm not suggesting that duplexes and triplexes and quads by right are appropriate throughout the city in every neighborhood. But I think smart people could sit down and look at the city and say, where would this be appropriate and available by right? Where is certain density? Should certain density be available by right, and certain housing types available by right? And you not have to go through, the headbanging that is required through the special use permit. Now, I don't think that's going to happen in, I don't think you're going to see quads by right in single family subdivisions. But I do think we're smart enough to sit down and figure out where some of these uses ought to be permissible, because they're in keeping with the content, the character of the community as it exists, or the community that it's moving towards.